My name is Tom Orrell, and I am part of the Data Values Project's technical advisory group and the founder of DataReady, a social enterprise established in 2017 which helps entities in the sustainable development and humanitarian sectors to improve their data governance. Today I'll be chatting with Gwen Phillips, who is currently championing the British Columbia First Nations Data Governance Initiative in Canada, which is committed to equipping First Nations with the capacity and resources they need to govern and own their community's data. Gwen is with us today to talk about this initiative and to share her broader take on indigenous data governance and the lessons that it holds for those of us working in the sustainable development sector. Gwen, thank you for being with us today. Indigenous data governance is particularly interesting because it touches upon the question of the protection and advancement of collective rights over data, which is often something that's missing in more Eurocentric approaches to data governance. So building on this theme, could you tell us a little bit more about First Nations data governance and why it's so important?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I think before we talk about data governance, it's important to talk about data sovereignty. And sovereignty, I think people know what that word kind of alludes to, that you're the owner or the supreme ruler over something. And identity is core to the concept of sovereignty as well when we're thinking about data sovereignty, indigenous data sovereignty, or in my instance, the Ktunaxa Nation's data sovereignty. And for the concept of sovereignty, owning our identity as Ktunaxa peoples. And so I'm a Ktunaxa person, and I belong to the Ktunaxa Nation. We speak the Ktunaxa language. I live in one of the communities, but many of our people live in other places, and some live in other places around the globe. And so the concept of sovereignty is about taking ownership of your identity and anything that relates to that identity. And that includes intellectual property. And that's that concept of collectivity, the ownership, collective ownership of identity, of history, of song, of story, of language, of worldview. And so taking ownership of that is right, an assertion of data sovereignty. And then data governance becomes the application of that in policy, in procedure, in setting out law or whatever you choose to do to actually take ownership and control of that identity and anything that relates to that identity.
Great. So thinking about data sovereignty and the work that you've done over the last few years, what are some of the key dimensions of that in practice? What are the kinds of things that you're pushing for in order to gain data sovereignty?
Well, I think one of the most challenging things for us is really a lack of recognition. Historically, I've been personally recognized as an Indian, and I still am under Canadian law, but as a Native person, as an Aboriginal person, as a First Nations person, and now as an Indigenous person. But not many recognize me as a Ktunaxa person. And so I think really that understanding that First Nations people in Canada are diverse. And in fact, there's approximately 80 unique languages, approximately 80 unique nations. And so in the Canadian context, the assertion of data governance, data sovereignty, and how we actually move things forward, it has to be with that core recognition of each nation group doing this work for themselves, however they see fit.
That's really interesting. So at any given time, as it were, there might be a large proportion of those 80 different nations seeking to assert data sovereignty over their own data sets, etc. And how do you coordinate that effort? Is there a coordinated effort, or does each nation pursue its own approach?
And that is why we actually established the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. Really what that initiative is a groups of nations working together as unique nations, but together so that we can advance our interests with more capital, so to speak. When you're one group speaking, you don't get a lot of attention, but when you bring voices together, not to give your sovereignty away, but to say, as unique nations, we're all saying the same thing. And so when the message gets louder and louder, you start to get a little bit of recognition. And so working together collaboratively is very important, but don't give your sovereignty away or have others represent your interests. They need to be working for you. Anybody that is an agency that is supporting the movement in data sovereignty should be working for the nations, behind them, so to speak. Where in many instances we have organizations and political groups and other groups that are sort of getting the ear and the eye and the attention of governments, federally and provincially. We've really got to get to that place where those two other governments recognize us as governments. We live in communities, but we are governed by groups of people that we select to do that for us, both hereditary leaders and elected leaders. So that recognition that we have governments, we need to relate government to government, and that data sovereignty is a high-level act of recognition that the Crown can give to us.
And have you got data sovereignty? You as a Ktunaxa person, does your nation have data sovereignty?
Well, I would say yes, because in Canada we have DRIP legislation. So the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People speak to ownership of intellectual property. They speak of ownership of identity and all of these things in a very philosophical way. So we do have it, but we have yet to be able to have it recognized. And that, as I say, is key. I can have all kinds of things, but if other people don't know I have them, what good are they? So do you have the right? It's only a philosophical thing. To assert the right is where the governance component comes in. And so data sovereignty, recognition, I believe so. In fact, the Minister of Indigenous Services quite recently said that he acknowledges Indigenous data sovereignty. But what that means and how it unpacks, I bet he doesn't know. And many nations may not know, because we are so crippled by the systems we work within, federally and provincially, to acquire resources, to do anything within our community environments, that data is probably in the back of many people's minds, way back in their minds. They don't see the importance of it until you see the power of it. And once you recognize the power of data, both to bring the concepts of who you are back within your own communities, and those processes are really healing processes as people self-determine again, it becomes a really an exciting and empowering concept that people are now embracing. So data sovereignty from the context of being something that was not understood to understanding now that it is actually one of the very first elements of recognition of the federal crown to us that then can lead to reconciliation.
I'm really intrigued by what you said there about the link between data sovereignty and identity, and about how data sovereignty can help to reflect identity and empower communities which have historically been marginalized and dispossessed. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Are there some examples you could give us about how data sovereignty has helped you to reassert that identity?
Well, I think quite recently there was a number of reports in the provincial system in British Columbia of racism in the healthcare system. And we did have the provincial government invest in, for the first time ever, a significant piece of research that probably had upwards of 6,000 to 7,000 respondents that provided information on their experiences. That data for the first time ever was held aside and set aside as collectively owned by those people who provided testimonial for First Nations and Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. So the province acknowledged that we own it, but we've yet got any kind of facility to hold it or make use of it. It's being held in trust by the researchers. So, I see these opportunities for us to build additional capacity, and especially in Canada right now, through the work of the First Nations Information Governance Centre, which is a collective assertion, again, of nations across Canada, through an organization to say, you've got to relate to us. That vision is that each nation of that organization is that each nation achieves data sovereignty within their own worldview. Each one of those 80 nations. British Columbia is home to 34 of those 80 nations in Canada. So we've got a very complex environment and approximately 200 communities that attach to those 34 linguistically unique nation groups. And so we see in practice that there's going to be a lot of work required to actually build any sort of capacity at the community level, at the nation level. What people don't understand is you own your data. You own your identity as an individual. And so when you self-determine, and I say, Ktunaxa, I am Ktunaxa, immediately there's a population group. That population owns their identity. Inside that population, there are also subgroups I'm a Ktunaxa woman, for example. There are LGBTQ two-spirited people inside the Ktunaxa population. And as soon as we identify a population, then we have to understand that population has a right to govern that data. And it might be joint governing with another government, some co-government or something like that. But at least we must have the right to determine who and how that data, who has that data and how that data is used. And so from the individual to the collective is a very important jump, I think, because people do recognize individual ownership. But how do we do this collective ownership? There's been a report that was also commissioned in British Columbia by the Office of the Human Rights Commission quite recently. And the report was published, it's called The Grandmother's Perspective. And in that report, the office recognized that governments shouldn't be collecting data unless it's for the good of the people that they're serving. Why are you collecting that data? So in that document, they also acknowledged indigenous data governance. And so now the province is having to think, how do we acknowledge that? How do we work on it? What do we do with that? So they have to work with us on that because we're the ones who own that right. They're the ones who have to respect that right.
Absolutely. So that's really interesting. And just to recap very briefly on some of the themes there, we've spoken about the importance of data sovereignty for Indigenous communities and First Nations communities, such as your own First Nations, as I should say, actually, rather than communities. And we've spoken about some of the challenges which you faced in terms of coordinating with other nations and with the federal government and provincial governments. But what is the link then with data governance? So you've mentioned a couple of times now that once data sovereignty is asserted, once it's recognized, we then move on to governance, and First Nations can then exert control over the data that relates to them as communities and as collectives. And why is that important to First Nations, to have that degree of control? What is it that you hope to do with that that's different from what the federal or provincial governments do with that data?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a fundamental question. Our values as individual nations, and then some that are shared collectively as the First Nations and Indigenous nations of Canada, are quite different than what I would say mainstream Canadian values are. And I have trouble even recognizing what those values are of mainstream Canadians in this modern day. And so for us, our interest is to collect data that helps us to determine how strong and healthy we are as the Ktunaxa peoples. What the federal government is working on is to close the gap between how well we are and Canadians. And for us, that's measuring assimilation. Why would we do that? And so self-determination is deciding who you are, who you were, who you are, and who you want to be. And data goes right along with that. And so we will no longer allow the federal government to report on how sick and ugly and dysfunctional Indigenous people are, because we're not. Sure, we're suffering, but that's the only data that they collect. They don't collect data that shows the strengths we have, the strengths we've had. They don't collect data that actually acknowledges even the assets we have in our communities. So for us, it's really about knowing who we are, knowing how well our people are, and being able to, at any given time, report on that to other people, to ourselves especially. Because as long as others are controlling the agenda, so to speak, controlling the data and controlling the investments, we're always going to be subject to being beggars in our homeland, really. And we don't want that.
I love that narrative of, and that perception, which unfortunately historically is so accurate, of measuring assimilation and measuring kind of homogeneity and conformance to established norms which others have established, as opposed to those which emanate from communities directly. So I can now see that really clear link between the assertion of data sovereignty as having the ultimate control and being the sovereign over data, and then that link to governance and control over that to determine your own destinies. And what I'm wondering is how far along that journey are you? And are there other positive examples that you can share of how your Ktunaxa nation or other nations that you're aware of have been able to leverage data and to govern it and control it in a way which has helped to change the their self-perception or others' perception of that nation?
Yeah, so my own nation has in the year 2000, we worked with an internationally recognized data firm to build the first data warehouse operable data warehouse that was person-centric. So we were looking to bring data from other government environments and our own into one common environment to be able to measure the well-being of an individual. And so we did a lot of data modeling and then looking at data governance around that. And so we've created a lot of different templates, a lot of different types of instruments and things to begin that process. What we've also done approximately 30, 40 years ago was begin the journey of defining what a strong, healthy Ktunaxa is. And so we started to look to measure that and create systems to create or capture the data to do that. And so we've been doing that to the best of our ability, but we're still recognized as a program recipient by the federal government. We're recognized as a First Nations community, not a government. And so we need those direct government investments, and we can continue and really bring this work to where it needs to get to. So in spite of, yes, we have. And quite recently, we did a really interesting exercise with the provincial government as we move to assert self-government. It's building basically towards the existing provincial standards for health and child welfare and education and all those things that the province has authority over under the Constitution of Canada. So as we were going about defining what a strong, healthy Ktunaxa is, and Dr. Christopher Horstief, a phenomenal Ktunaxa academic working with us, looking at the 12 determinants of health that are fairly generalizable and portable that, globally people are saying, yeah, culture is one of those determinants. And so as soon as you apply that determinant and use that as the lens for looking at those other determinants, you can get to that place where you can have generalizability, a little bit of portability, but more so you have your lens to look at things that are important to you. And so when we started to do that work and develop indicators, which are socioeconomic and environmental indicators, because all go hand in hand. The determinants of health look at the individual circumstances, behaviors, environments, etc., right? And all of those things have impact on your wellness. And so when we did that work and we defined what a well Ktunaxa was in those various environments, such an empowering process, I must say, for our people. But then when we worked with the provincial government to say, this is what we want to measure, what data do you have in your environment that attaches to it, because the majority of our people are still served by them, they came back with approximately 700 indicators across multiple divisions of ministries and departments and agencies and what have you, but only about a dozen or two related to the Ktunaxa worldview of what we suggested was well-being. So the data gap that exists is not so much in we don't have access to the data they have. It's there's no data in place, not even the descriptions of what well-being is from our worldview. We've never had the investments in a modern time to do that self-determining work. And so each nation is doing this in their own pace. Some are very advanced. My own nation is quite advanced. And so it's been one by one really doing this work. And again, because we have so many challenges in our community, from unsafe drinking water to moldy houses to everything else because of these jurisdictional issues, et cetera, and not even having the data to prove it in many instances. We've got to, go and get researchers to come in. Come on, because administrative data is not there. Once we can get these very fundamental and very, in my mind, easily correctable things done, which is to create a nation-to-nation relationship, identify those 80 nation groups that exist, Treasury Board fund us as governments. We will account for those funds by using good data. Yes, we'll have auditable processes and systems. We have technology, but what you measure is what matters. And if it's not what matters, then why measure it?
That's an excellent phrase. I think that's a brilliant way to summarize it, and to summarize the difference in values that you mentioned earlier in the conversation. And it seems like it's a journey which is ongoing, and one that I hope that we can pick up a discussion about perhaps in a couple of years and see how far your nation has come. In the meantime, thinking more broadly, I can think of many different communities around the world which are facing similar kinds of issues, whether they're indigenous peoples or whether they're stateless peoples, dispossessed peoples, or refugees and asylum seekers, who face similar kind of challenges as collectives that relate deeply to their identity in one way or another. which I think resonates strongly with the work that you're doing and the link between identity and data sovereignty. And I just wonder what messages you have for them, for other communities outside of Canada and Canada's First Nations, about how to start this process of asserting data sovereignty or asserting data rights as collectives. What messages do you have for them?
I think a key message is that you really have to be assertive in saying this is who we are, right? You don't have to have all of the infrastructure in place to actually do governance, which is the policies, procedures, all of those things, right? That sovereignty component, that primary assertion of this is who we are, this is what these are the rights we're saying we have, now respond to us. Right, just that general assertion. So I think that assertion in the sovereignty, that assertion of sovereignty, is a very important thing, and it is just it is a philosophical thing, really, until you get unpack it into that further into governance and then down into government, because that's the next step, right? Is actually dropping it down to the level of government, where all of those institutions on a daily basis have systemic responses to this is how do we capture. So right now, for example, again, when we go into the provincial's environment, they don't know whether we're a First Nations person or not, right? Unless there is an absolute key place somewhere in a ministry or department, which is usually a money juncture of a transfer of payment somewhere, to identify us. So for global populations that are unique populations facing challenges with broader states, it's almost like, I don't know if you know the cartoon Horton Hears a Who. It was the elephant and the dust speck. It was a Dr. Seuss
I'm sorry.
thing anyway. So it was basically a small little community that lived on a dust speck. And this elephant was the only one who could hear it, and they were going to destroy it. Anyway, long story short, they all had to stand together and shout, "We are here, we are here, we are here," to be heard. And I guess that's what I'm saying, is that we fight on each other. We've been conditioned to fight on each other because we've been impoverished, we've been suppressed, we've been put into these laterally violent modes almost because of the suppression of the other governments and oppression, outright oppression. And so we have to liberate ourselves as people, as humans, to know, what, if this is going to get better, I have to be the one to make it better. And I can find somebody else to work with that's thinking the same way. And then there's 2 of us, and then there's 3 of us, and then there's 4 of us. And so a small population working with other populations, and it doesn't need to be an indigenous group working with another indigenous group. It can be, as you say, a smaller group of refugees from another country that is in that area, right? So partnering up, and First Nations in Canada are really seeing this now, how we are gaining a lot of empathy, I would say. And I think the news has shown that our history is, the stories we've told are true. And so as this empathy is there, we have to not just sit down and cry. We have to actually stand up and say, this is what we have to do about it, right? You can't stop at the place of saying we have a right, because that actually translates to a responsibility, right? And so the Ktunaxa believe that we have responsibilities and privileges to enable that right to say Hunini Ktunaxa. And so that's, I think, globally, again, the small groups working together, recognizing that we're all challenged, and not fighting against each other, but figuring out how we work together and support each other. Because even though many of us have differences, at the end of the day, we all love our children, and we all want clean water and clean air. So,
absolutely. I think, you've hit the nail on the head there, in terms of identifying the link between identity, assertion, community self-determination, and the value of information within that process, the value of being recognized as an equal steward, as an equal broker and partner in the control of information about yourself and about your nation and about your community, about your history and about your future and your identity, and all the other steps that then flow from that. And the message that you shared, about communities around the world taking that first step and having that recognition and that assertion respected and recognized by others is really key. as a first step, I guess, in asserting control first, and then practicing that control, through data governance, through those policies and those protocols, and reducing it to government thereafter. We're unfortunately at the end of this conversation now, at the end of this fireside chat, but it's been absolutely fascinating to hear your perspective and very moving to learn about the value of data, the value of data sovereignty to your nation, the Ktunaxa people. And all I can say is thank you very much for taking part in this fireside chat. And I look forward perhaps to picking up the conversation at a future date as well. Thank you so much, Gwen Phillips, for taking part.
Thank you. Anwunekit.